1, 2, 3, 4. Welcome back after lunch, everybody. We were expecting a musical interference here, but unfortunately we have none. So I take the liberty of reading a short poem, extremely short poem by Thomas Tranströmer, in English by Bob Fulton. And the title in Swedish is Realm of Insecurity. And the translator has chosen National Insecurity. Take your own pick. The Undersecretary leans forward and draws an X, and her eardrops dingle like the swords of Damocles. As a mottled butterfly is invisible against the ground, so the demon merges with the opened newspaper. A helmet worn by no one has taken the power. The mother turtle flies, flying under the water. The last seminar of today deals with social protection and the post-2015 agenda. Sociala trygghetssystem och utvecklingsagendan post-2015. And the moderator of this session is Annika Söder, who is the executive director of Dag Hammarskjöld Foundation, and prior to that she was a senior manager in the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization and had several years at the Foreign Department as spokesperson for the Foreign Ministry and as foreign policy advisor to the Prime and to several Swedish foreign ministers. The floor is yours, Annika, and the panels.
Thank you very much, Ulrika, and it's great to see that so many of you are still around here. I think this will be a most exciting conversation between very, very knowledgeable people, and all of you also very knowledgeable will have a chance to intervene later on when we've heard from the panelists. You recognize many of them. Here we have Claire Courteille, who is the director for the quality department in the International Trade Union Confederation. took, as we say in Swedish, you may not know that. And there they deal with inequality issues, gender, and social affairs. We have Erik Lysén, who is the head of the international department of the Church of Sweden. And before that, he worked with policy issues as well in the church. Sten Rylander, former ambassador to many African countries, and presently the president of Forum Syd, an NGO umbrella here in Sweden. And Gunilla Carlsson, a member of the high-level panel on the post-2015 agenda. The title is even longer, but I will not give the full title to you. The report looks like this. Gunilla also, until very recently, also the Minister for the International Development Cooperation of Sweden. She's been a member of Parliament in Sweden and in the European Parliament, and she is also the Vice President of the Moderate Party. And last but not at all least, Anna Brandt, who also has a past in Africa as ambassador in Kenya. She has been the executive director of the Nordic-Baltic constituency in the World Bank until very recently, and has just started to work as an ambassador at large for post-2015 issues in the Swedish Ministry for Foreign Affairs. So what is social protection and what is the post-2015 agenda and how do they come together? I guess that is what we are going to discuss here this afternoon. And if you look in Wikipedia, you will see that social protection is about labor market interventions, it's about social insurance, and it's about social assistance. We all know that this is a quite contentious issue. We also know that the definition of the concept has been discussed today and yesterday to a very large extent. So I think I will stop there in order not to get into any difficulty. So what is the post-2015 agenda? As we all know, we've had the Millennium Development Goals. They will finish to be valid in 2015. And we also know that some of them have been quite successful, some less successful. We also know that when we look at the data from the work on how the MDGs have been achieved, we will see that the success is quite uneven. It reveals inequalities between different groups, also between men and women. They're also weak, as we know, on environmental issues and on climate and planetary boundaries as such. So that is why it has been decided to work on new goals to further enhance the agenda related to poverty, related to the environment and to social development. The high-level panel, of which Gunilla was a member, finished their work in May and left their report. And after that, we've received a report from the UN Secretary General, Ban Ki-moon, that is called Life of Dignity for All. And that, in turn, will be the basis for intergovernmental negotiations that will start, that have in a way already started, but that will be more formalized next year and continue to September 2015, when the 190 plus member states of the United Nations may arrive at a new agenda for development to 2030. The high-level panel says a few words about social protection, and we will hear more about that from Gunilla Carlsson. And also the Secretary General's report mentions social protection as a major driver for development and welfare and prosperity in the years to come. I'm really happy now to give the floor to Gunilla Carlsson that will give her views on social protection and the links to the international work on this agenda.
Thank you, Annika. And I will just stand here a little easy to talk. I would like to thank the Swedish Church.
Håll in en liten stund.
Jo då, nu hörs det, eller hur? Tack. And I wanted to start with thanking the Swedish Church for bringing us together in these times, but also on this very topic. It was highly rewarding for me to be in this panel and also to be in this generation that actually can end poverty in our times. It is a daunting task ahead of us, but I'm sure we can make it, but it's going to be difficult. And to elaborate upon these things and to see what drives development and how the world are changing these days, but also to understand that we need sustainable world, but also sustainable changes, both when it comes to an economic point of view, but also how we can have people with us. It's about participation and to see that people can be empowered and that we start to discuss also within the UN from another perspective, trying to have the individuals at the forefront and to see how can governments be held accountable, how can global governance assist people moving out of poverty, because they're going to do it themselves, but they need the tools to do it. But we also know from our perspective, sitting here in Courteille, Sweden, that the last mile will be the hardest to walk. We have seen a tremendous efforts in reducing, halving poverty only the last 15 years. But the last mile will be the hardest to walk. And now we have to address the marginalized people of the world, those that are not part of globalization, but also to bring in human rights at core of the development agenda. That is, of course, the worst violence against human rights is, of course, war and conflicts. But if we just also look to that many people that today are living in poverty are that they, of course, lack the means of improving their own lives, but also that many of them are excluded because they are not recognized that they have rights, like ethnic minorities, people living with disabilities, LGBT, or well, whatever. We have to also address the role of human rights in this, because too many people that live in poverty are deprived their rights. What we did in the high-level panel was, of course, to talk about emergencies. What happens? How can we have more resilient communities and more resilient citizens? But also to see how poverty today are, the face of poverty today, and voices from the poor. We started from Sweden to give a lot of money to be able to see what do we know about poor people's aspirations and to update our views about what they want. And I think it's very important also to see that we have decided upon a universal agenda. I just came back from United States. 49 million people living on food stamps or needing them in order to have nourished good enough kids. So it's not only about sub-Saharan Africa. It is a universal agenda now. And that's why we have to also have a universal approach and to see that it's all about us. It's also about Sweden, how we can work on alleviating poverty, but also to see what are changing the world, and that is the huge generation. We have talked a lot about the need for statistics and knowing what the poor people want, but we also have looked into demographics and to see that there is a huge bulge today that will certainly transform the world if they are able to take part. And that's why we talked a lot about what do young people want, and they want jobs. And I think a social protection agenda without addressing labor markets, talking about migration, and to see how we can be able to see what the young people actually ask us to do would be an agenda that won't fit for the future. And there, I think, that also was so obvious what they wanted, and many of those people we reached out to was also to ask for accountability from governments. We can talk about the faces of poverty, but if we don't have governance structures to be able to create environments for making people lift themselves out of poverty, we can go on talking. But also the facts that we say today, that many poor people are living in relatively healthy countries. The inequalities within countries are as challenging as the inequalities between countries. Hence the universal agenda. I also promised to talk a little bit about what can we do with the social security systems, because that has been the theme for this fantastic conference. And I think what we have addressed is also that we need effective institutions, but also that we need innovative systems that work. How is the social security systems working today? Well, it has worked, you could argue, and we are celebrating 100 years with pension in Sweden. But we have adjusted it over time to make it resilient, to answer to the question of globalization, and to see that they are strong enough to really fulfill what they are aimed to do. And they are based on, as Mr. Palme said earlier, labor participation. We can't have wealth if we don't create wealth. And that's why we have to work in a globalized world where things are changing so rapidly to see how we also can make our systems function. In many of the poorest countries, we have informal systems that do work, but they don't work at scale. And we have to make people move from informal jobs to formal in order to be able to also deliver on effective governance and to move to scale, because it's about sharing risks, as I see it and the panel. And that's why I think that we have learned in Sweden, and if I now talk as a former minister responsible for this and a donor's perspective when it comes to building social security systems, I think it's very important to see that this is very tasty for development cooperation in a modern way, because it's about giving individuals access to opportunities. I think it's far more interesting than doing general budget support. But I think it's also something where we can have compacts around, and where we can see that we can actually introduce experiences and capacity in how we work with an inclusive labor market, and also how we address people living in more vulnerable situations. And that's why I think the question about how we design this system will be the interesting thing. To see the principles of macroeconomic stability. I met too many finance ministers that are worried when we are making changes that their macroeconomic stability will be hampered. And I think this has to be addressed. We have to see that it's economic sustainable with the social security systems to help with a functioning economy. And to turn this around, it's not about social protection, it is about strong functioning economies. And to describe it rather in that perspective in order to improve the speediness of delivering on introducing social security systems in countries. I think we have to portray it from another angle. I think also that it's not only about creating the social systems, it's also about mobilizing own resources. And that was also we talked about in the panel. Functioning governance structures and mobilizing own resources. And they are both natural resources and human resources, and building tax bases. And to have this inclusive economy while also addressing the role of women. Women participation on the labor market, women emancipation, and women being able to earn their livings and their pensions, and to move from formal to informal sector. And that's why I become a true believer in introducing more of social security systems within development cooperation, both as when I learned over these years, over the high-level panels work on how does poverty look today, but also how can we mildly assist in helping others to develop themselves. I think, Annika, I end there. I'd like to go on, but I think it's better that I try to be honest with time and come back in your questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Gunilla. Can I ask you, when you discussed this in the high-level panel and ended up with the formulation that X% should be covered, of the poor should be covered by some sort of social intervention, did you discuss the sort of the ideological contestation around general policies or targeted policies in the panel?
Yes, because there is also the risk that when we are now talking about a global universal development agenda, that we are losing the poorest of the poor because they don't have a voice. You know, it's a lot of middle-income earners in middle-income countries that are now driving the agenda. So what about the poorest of the poor, and to strengthen their resilience in a globalized world? And that's why we set up that kind of target. But we have also discussed a lot what drives development, and rather talk about decent jobs, effective institutions, to see how we can have the need for accountability, as I mentioned. So rather to see how can we make people be employable and to be part of the labor market. That was mainly our answers to the huge bulk of people that are not yet enjoying globalization, and the most vulnerable, as you said before with your Wikipedia mentioning. We have to see that we can assist people only from an emergency point of view, but to move that out of emergency into sustainability and resilience, if you see what I mean. So that's how we talked about this. But that's also experiences, from example, from Kenya, where we have introduced social security systems in order to help people come out of emergency situations, but where they have been transformed to more general social security systems. So that was how we tried to work on this, because one fear I have, and sorry for being so lengthy, it is that $2 a day is really nothing. And the risk is that the middle classes of the middle-income worlds today would allow ourselves to just have that little target and not making people being able to participate on a global world. So that, I think, is also very important to see that this is temporarily, and to see that more people have to be allowed to be in an inclusive economy. And I think that we talked a lot about. So we shouldn't just only look into that target, because if we then think the agenda is finished, I think we have not assisted the young people of today how they should participate.
And one can see in the report that you really discussed this $1.25 a day as something that you wouldn't really stand for anymore. And we can also see in the Secretary General's report that that level will probably be raised. But then when you look at a decent living, you may think of $20 a day rather than one or two. But we're making progress.
And that will not solve the problem anyhow, because it's just paying away the problem. We have to transform our economies so that they are more inclusive. You see what I mean? Because if we have 1 billion people living on $2 or $20 a day just as beneficiaries, that's not good enough, because people need to participate.
Absolutely.
To be allowed to participate.
Absolutely, but I think there are at least two views on that. That the way to measure is $2 or $1 or $20
and we
a day,
have to start
then we're
some-
not talking about subsidies.
No, we have to start somewhere,
Necessarily.
and to make people survive, but also to have the means for education, for health, in order to take part. And too many today are deprived their rights, but also their opportunities.
Thank you very much. We may come back to that later in the discussion. Now, Claire, we will really look forward to listen to what you have to say about the international trade union movement's views on social protection, and also on maybe the social protection floor that I know is close to the heart of the Confederation. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay. Well, let me also start by thanking for the invitation. It's really nice to be here. And for those of you who are not familiar with the ITUC, we are the International Confederation of Trade Unions, and we have about 315 members, I think maybe 216. I think we just affiliated a new one throughout the world, and including the LO-TCO of Sweden. And we've been discussing a lot the issue of the post-2015 agenda among our structure. And actually, we ended up with about the same priorities as Mrs. Carlsson said. You know, what people want, what workers want is decent job and social protection. And closing the gender gap was also a very important aspect of it. But so we agree on those priorities, decent work and social protection. Since this conference focuses more on social protection, I'm going to develop a bit more the social protection aspect. So what is, of course, the evil is in the details, as we say in English, meaning that we can all agree on social protection and decent work, but what do we mean exactly with that? And that was the subject of this conference. And so let me give 5 points from the ITUC perspective. What do we mean by social protection? I've got 5 minutes, so I decided to have 5 points. So that's 1 minute each. So first, the priority should be on extension. We need to extend the cover of social protection. Today we've got 80% of the world population that is inadequately covered, doesn't have any protection at all or have inadequate protection. That's not good. So priority, extending coverage. What we are saying at the ITUC is that we need to have a double extension strategy. We need to extend coverage, what we call the horizontal dimension, covering as many people as possible, but also the vertical dimension, saying we need also to look at the levels of benefits, because we all know in developing countries sometimes the level of benefit is just not helping much. So we need to have this double strategy, horizontal dimension and vertical dimension, and an extension. And those two dimensions go together. They are indissociable. My second point has been discussed quite a lot in this conference, and it's the rights-based approach to social protection. And it's true that what we've seen, what our trade unions are telling us in the world, is that the social protection system are fragmented. You will have, different programs. I think the colleague from Bangladesh was mentioning in the previous panel, 95 programs, social security program in Bangladesh only. That's a lot for a country that has a weak institutional capacity. And I have to say that sometimes donors don't help. They, contributing to this fragmentation of social protection system, because they come with their program, their priority, their requirements, and then that contribute to this fragmentation. So really, the rights-based approach to social protection for us is a key point. So the entitlement should be based on rights established by law. And this is a bit what the notion of the concept of the social protection floor. So we support the universality of rights, but being flexible on how you can realize those rights, because social protection is different in Bangladesh than it is in my own country, for example. So we have to be flexible on the ways, but we have to be very strong on the rights. And I think this is also what Mrs. Carlsson was telling us. The third point, and that was also mentioned in her presentation, is the link between social protection and decent work. And this is sometimes hard to understand, or it's not well understood, at least that's my experience. It's a very complex dimension, but this is exactly what we were discussing before. So the sustainability of social protection depends on decent work. If you don't have decent work, you'll never have a sustainable social protection system. So I don't want to enter into in the complex details of, whether it's tax funded or whether it's contributory schemes, because I think both are fine as long as they meet the rights of the people. But there is I guess my point is to say that the design of social security system should respond to the labor market characteristic of the country. And let me take an example that I think you mentioned, that's the issue of informality at work. This is a global issue, it's a universal issue, even in Europe. I mean, I'm sure in Sweden you will find some degree of informality at work as well. And if you look at how social security can respond to this issue of informality at work, then you have to be very careful, because you don't want to encourage more informality at work through a badly designed social protection system. So what we've been discussing in our structure is that in a development context, in a developing country context, you broadly have two categories of informal workers. You would have the on-account workers, and you would have the wage workers. The wage workers that for which the employer doesn't pay any contribution, but that's a very important part of the workers. So, and knowing that requires really having a different approach in terms of setting the right social protection system and the right benefits, because you want to encourage both. You want to encourage decent work, the creation of decent work, and you want to, encourage a good social protection. My fourth point is tripartism. Social protection systems should be designed and implementing from a tripartite perspective. This is what we think, together with workers and employers' organization. But we have also a large definition of tripartism. We agree that, in some countries, unions are not necessarily very strong, so we need friends, we need allies with the civil society organization. But then we think that those civil society organizations has to be relevant and they have to be member-based, because they have to speak on behalf of the people they represent. I think somebody was saying this morning, we cannot have non-governmental individuals. And I quite like the expression, because it's a reality as well. And the fifth and last point, because I think I'm arriving at the end of my 5 minutes, is affordability, of course. You cannot talk, social security if you don't address the issue of affordability. And that takes us very rapidly to the issue of fiscal space and taxation policy and fiscal reform, etc. And what I wanted to say, though, that I've been in several experts' meetings, and I feel so uncomfortable in those experts' meetings when it comes to affordability, because then you would have the experts saying, oh, they can't afford, those countries cannot afford. 3% of GDP is too high. 10% of GDP is just too high. They will never afford it. And you see, in my country, where I come from, we've got over 50%, I come from Europe, we've got over 50% of GDP that is spent on social protection. And everybody think it's normal. Why? Because that's the democratic dimension, because this is what the people want. So you see, we have to, the issue of affordability, in our view, it's a democratic question. It's not up to me, it's not up to you, it's up to the people to define and to decide how much they want to spend on social security as part of their budget. So the issue, and I'm finalizing with that, the issue of people voice, giving people voice in the discussion on social protection is essential, because it's a technical issue. And a lot of people come with technical issue. We have to go back to the roots, we have to give people a voice, and this is what we are trying to do in the trade union movement, trying to organize people around demand for better social protection. Thank you very much.
I read an article by a colleague of yours in the Confederation that was not very happy with how the high-level panel had treated the issue of social protection. Could you describe that, and could you also maybe mention how you see a way forward in the years to come?
Yeah. Well, I think there is first of all, I think there is space for hope. I mean, that can always be improved, because there is this process of negotiation now that's going to take place. But I think what we were worried about is, there has been consensus at the international level around the social protection floor. It has been, we talk a lot about the ILO, the International Labour Organization recommendation. It has been also adopted by the UN in the General Assembly. There have been many initiatives, many support. The G20 also referred to the importance of social protection floor. So we think we've been struggling, at least from our perspective, working very hard with our civil society partners to get this notion of a floor. And we didn't find it back in the report. So we were worried about that. We were worried about this at least in the first report, there was a bit of a reluctance toward the rights-based approach to social protection. And of course, we understand that having a universal system is a cost, and that some governments, might be worried about the cost, of course. But we think that the UN should have the ambition, set the ambition. What we need really is to extend coverage. We need to have this right-based approach. We need to have this perspective of redistribution. That's, it's about political willingness at the end of the day. So somebody has to have the political courage to say it.
Thank you so much. And now over to Erik Lysén, who will tell us more about how the Church of Sweden works with social protection and partners, and also a little bit about why the post-2015 agenda matters in this context.
Thank you very much. I think I will be sitting here still so that I can comment on. Do you hear me? No. Of course you don't hear me because I have to put on. Now, do you hear me now?
No. Lite längre.
Stay stuck with it for a while.
No.
Now we'll see. You hear me now? No?
Yes.
Here I am.
Exciting.
Well, thank you very much. I see this as a fantastic opportunity for coming together from different sectors of society, from academia, from UN organization, from civil society networks, and that's exactly where I see the specific role for Church of Sweden, that we can, together with HelpAge and others, to create these kinds of platforms where we have sort of share experiences from the different national contexts where we now discuss the successes and some of the complexities that we see with which social protection systems are associated. Just to say that I think we started to work on the issue of social protection. That came from an overriding focus on eradicating poverty that we have had as a major theme for many years in our Lenten campaigns in the church. And we had a traditional focus on small-scale farming and small-scale agricultural development, but obviously taking into account the much broader picture. And that is some of sort of the realization that has come with time is, of course, that we have to look at this comprehensively. It's not only about small-scale farming, it's about analyzing and discussing the effects of trade policies, effects of climate change, and increasingly the need for social protection systems. So this started perhaps 4 or 5 years ago, but we felt we were still at a very initial stage, and therefore we published an anthology with various contributions from key people in the academic world, but also from NGO networks and partners that we are working with. So that's how it started for Church of Sweden, and after we published this anthology, we felt it's important to continue then to have different kinds of seminars and conferences, and where we can serve sort of as a conduit for making you to meet on this issue. What has been clear from the discussions we've listened to here up to now is, of course, that first of all, a conclusion that we can draw is that social protection systems were not exactly at the center of the policy debate sort of 10 to 15 years ago, as was said by Ronald Wieman. At that time, it was mainly referred to as sort of social safety nets. So in that sense, we have moved. Today, we are talking about social protection floors. It's been said by many speakers here that it has to be seen as a social protection floor. That's where we are starting. We have to gradually build the systems. And it has to be incorporated in much broader economic and social terms. So this is only the starting point. But clearly what we see from these different social transfers that have been introduced in different countries is positive outcomes in terms of reducing malnutrition among children under the age of 5, in terms of sending their pupils to the school or to the local health, being able to visit the local health clinics. So in that sense it works. But what we have heard from the different presentations here this morning, for instance, is also about some of the complexities when we're discussing universalism versus targeting and that it also depends on the different national contexts and the different political struggles that we have in the countries. So the political economy of social protection is a very important aspect, and that is something we need to continue to discuss. That has not been covered so much in some of the books and anthologies that we have written. When it comes to the global MDG framework that will replace, after 2015, the current MDG framework, I think still global norm setting is incredibly important, showing this global commitment to a much broader development agenda. As you said, social protection is mentioned there, but it's still seen sort of as a residual element instead of being at the center of things. Seeing it as a way of investing in people's rights and responsibilities and capabilities. See it as investing in people's rights and capabilities. There is this discussion about global norms and on the one hand, but the need for having national targets. And of course, given the national complexities, it's incredibly important to locate this discussion to the specific national context. Because of the different political forces we have in Uganda and Bangladesh, for instance. And this is key for civil society mobilization, to mobilize from these different contexts and build alliances. For social protection to be recognized as an important tool for creating social trust in society, for establishing sort of social pacts and norms between government and citizens. And that's where I see also the added value of social protection as a starting point, that we start gradually with building up a social protection floor, but then it has to be part of a much broader economic and social development agenda.
Thank you very much. Out of curiosity, I have two follow-up questions. Is this being discussed in the church meeting, I kyrkomötet, in Sweden, about social protection in Sweden, and how do you liaise with partners in other churches around the globe?
It's being discussed in the church, although I think we can also be a bit self-critical in the sense it has come as a new issue. But we have adopted a position paper on social protection, and that's been adopted by the International Commission that is, of course, linked to the Church Synod and the Church Board. I still believe that we have some work to do in order to conscientize also the church members in Church of Sweden. But obviously we have written a lot about it. Some of the anthology that I mentioned has been, of course, publicized, and it's been widely discussed. When it comes to context with partners, we are right in the middle of forming sort of a community of practice within the International Church Alliance, the ACT Alliance, Action by Churches Together. Where we come together as church aid organizations to try to build a political momentum on this issue. I think we have one of our sister organizations here also from Germany, Bread for the World, but what is the most important thing here is also to make it truly global, that we have a strong participation from our southern church aid organization and partners to make this agenda happen. We are also supporting sort of more specific networks that are focusing on social protection issues, like the SPPI in South Africa, where we just started a partnership a year ago. RDRS is a partner to Church of Sweden as well, and we got the example from Bangladesh just in the session before this one. So in different ways, we're also trying to work in coalition and alliances. It does not mean always that we will go for support financially, but that we have a common agenda from which we are working. So that is important for Church of Sweden.
Thank you very much, Erik. And now over to Anna Brandt. You just came home from Washington, where you worked as executive director in the World Bank, and we know that in the recent years the World Bank has started to look into the field of social protection, and it's also involved in some programs in different countries. So it would be very interesting to hear about that, as well as about how you see the role of Sweden in the future work on the post-2015 agenda.
I will also move up here. Can you hear me? Good. Well, big thanks to the Church of Sweden and Annika
for inviting me here today. It's great to be here with you. First, I think, as has been said, the issue of social protection didn't feature in the original Millennium Declaration or the Millennium Development Goals that we're actually working towards today. But a lot of changes have happened in the last decades that really have meant that the international community has to take the issue of social protection much more seriously, and the international community is working much more on social protection now than 10, 15 years ago. One reason is the growing inequalities in the world between countries and within countries, and these inequalities have basically grown everywhere except in Latin America, where we've had strong social protection programs being developed in the last decade. The globalization and new technologies are obviously being used and taken advantage by people who are relatively better off than the poorest, and therefore we can expect that these inequalities, if nothing is done, will actually continue to grow. And the second reason is, of course, the increased recognition of risk and vulnerabilities in relation to poverty and ways of trying to reduce them. And that's the backdrop against which the World Bank has been developing its support to social protection over the last years. And I would say that the big push for the bank to focus more on these issues was the global financial crisis of 2008 and lingering on for a number of years. There was a tremendous increase in demand for the World Bank support in the aftermath of the crisis, not least from middle-income countries. And the two main areas where the bank focused its support as a response to the crisis was, one, infrastructure, financial services, and two, social protection. And the bank has done some research about the recent social protection programs that have been established in developing countries, and they're estimating that although social protection the coverage of social protection is very sketchy, and it varies a lot from regions to regions and between countries, they're estimating that roughly 150 million people worldwide are prevented from falling into extreme poverty thanks to social protection programs. As I said, the pattern is very uneven, and in fact, it's in the middle-income countries where the programs are preventing people from falling into extreme poverty the most, and less so in the lower-income countries, and that is because we have less coverage there. We know that sub-Saharan Africa is the region with the least coverage when it comes to social protection. And what the bank has been trying to do, obviously the bank will support countries as a response to them demanding support from the bank. The support that the bank is giving is obviously support to countries' own programs. But what the bank can do together with governments is to help improve the efficiency of programs, consolidate a lot of the smaller, fragmented programs into bigger national programs. The bank can also help in rationalizing overlapping programs. There is quite a lot of overlap in some of the programs that exist. And the bank can also help in supporting governments' focus programs better to those that are most needy. And the way the bank looks at social protection is very much in conjunction with labor. The bank's strategy for working in this area is called the Strategy for Social Protection and Labour. So, just as we heard previously, these are sort of two sides of one coin. And the social protection programs are very much intended to help individuals also improve their opportunities and possibilities to enter the labor market. It's also a means whereby inequalities can be reduced, and not least inequalities between men and women, because some of these programs are specifically targeted towards women. And as I said previously, to clearly reduce risk and vulnerability and actually encourage risk-taking where that would be needed in terms of, for instance, mobility in the labor market or for promoting entrepreneurship. Another area where the bank has started to do quite a lot of research, and I think this is a very interesting and promising area, that is looking at existing subsidy programs in countries, not least energy subsidies and specifically fossil fuel subsidies that are that exist in quite a number of countries. These subsidies are often costly and not very well targeted to the poorest. And a number of conversations are ongoing between the bank and member countries who would like to reform their subsidy systems, reduce these untargeted, rather costly subsidy systems, and instead use these funds for better targeted, efficient social protection programs. Now, the bank has done a lot more in middle-income countries than in low-income countries, but in the last 2-3 years, there has been a large increase in the bank support to low-income countries. And as we all know, and as I said initially, that is where the coverage is the least and where more efforts are the greatest. And I'm very happy to see Charlotte Petri here, because SIDA has also participated with the bank through contributing $10 million to a trust fund to enable the bank to work with the poorest countries in sub-Saharan Africa, in helping to catalyze demand and interest for setting up social protection programs. So these issues are about affordability, but I think from the bank's point of view, there is also a lot of things to do in terms of just improving the current systems, making them more efficient, getting more out of them, getting them more targeted, and secondly, as I said, looking at existing subsidy programs that are both financially costly and in some cases also environmentally costly, and see if one can redistribute those expenditures into better working social protection programs. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Anna. I will very soon hand over to Sten. Before doing that, I'd like you to think about what you would like to comment upon or ask questions about, because the floor will be open for all of you when we've listened to Sten. Sten Rylander, former ambassador to Namibia, Angola, Zimbabwe, Tanzania. More? That's enough. And Botswana. No, you were head of the development assistance in Botswana.
Yeah,
will speak to us about what he has seen in his very many important jobs in the field, and how he sees that matter in the field of social protection. So the floor is yours.
Thank you. I was very happy yesterday morning listening to Thandika Makandawire at the opening session. He is a good African, as we all know, but also an honorary Swede. Thandika has been so much ahead of his time, our time, when it comes to the whole issue we are discussing at this conference. At the very early stages, he was a driving force in the debate on social protection, or we may have used other words then, both internationally and in Sweden. For many years, I would say decades, you could hear his lonely voice in the desert. Where is Sweden in this? Where are the Nordic countries in this whole debate, given our proud legacy in this area? Very good question. And what we actually do now is to catch up with Thandika. And also Sweden is coming around, or has been coming around, I would say. I would like to compliment and pay tribute to the Church of Sweden, who have played such an important role in bringing this whole issue back to the debate, into the debating forums, and rediscovered this area. And we just heard Gunilla Carlsson, until very recently our minister. She said she has become a convinced believer in this, and she has been bringing in this issue of social protection into the post-2015 process. Thank you, Gunilla, and thank you for your continued interest, even after stepping down from your post as Minister of Development Cooperation. We heard Charlotte Petri Gornitska just before the coffee break, also telling about SIDA gearing up its support through the World Bank and also directly to some countries in Sub-Saharan Africa, TASAF in Tanzania and other places. Thandika made another very important point. Help create policy space for countries and governments in Africa and other places. Continue to create and support research networks and promote research cooperation. I think it's very important. We have been very good at that in Sweden. I would say 10 years ago we were very good. Maybe we have lost momentum now a little bit, and I think we can do more. Also to improve conditions for international researchers who would like to come and study in Sweden. I've been impressed to see what is going on in Africa in the field of social protection. And the driving force has not been so much the donor community as I've seen it in some countries. It's been more a domestic interest and the local civil society pushing governments in Africa and African leaders to do more to fight poverty through cash transfer programs and other social protection programs. The bilateral donors have been rather reluctant, at least in some countries I know of, in Tanzania and other places, because they see that they might be redundant once you have Africa-owned and managed social protection systems in place. So the African ownership is there, and I would say it's increasing. We heard from the Africa Union during the seminar. We have the AU platform for social protection. Been quite dynamic work there carried out under the leadership of our friend Beans Kavanas from Namibia when she was the commissioner for social sectors in 9 years. But also I think there is an increasing understanding that higher economic growth rates need to be complemented by more determined efforts to fight poverty, achieve transformative change, and to lessen the rapidly growing income gaps. There is no time to review individual country situations, but I strongly see a case emerging for more general and universal systems, which are also easier to administrate. Less constraints, less targeting, less conditions, spending less energy on trying to define a narrow definition of the deserving poor, so to say. these are controversial issues, but I really do believe that this is the way to go. You can also, it depends on the political environment. I think Torsten Wetterblad brought this out, that the leeway for politicians and leaders to take decisions is sometimes complicated. It depends also on age. If you're an old leader, it's more difficult to agree to giving out cash to poor people who are jobless and so on. If you're a younger leader like Jakaya Kikwete in Tanzania, he's just about to try to roll out the TASAF scheme to 7 million people. Costly exercise, but he doesn't hesitate to do that. I was impressed by Jimmy and Andesina's presentation this morning. He said we must end social vivisectonomy. What does it mean? I think he said, do away with donor-financed impositions dividing local communities. Go for multitasked, transformative programs in good cooperation with locally grounded civil society. I think Stephen Kidd also touched on this when he warned against neoliberal approaches that could be divisive in the local communities. I agree on that. That leads me to my final point, strong point, I think, and I wish to make it on behalf of the organization I represent, Forum Syd, fairly broad umbrella organization, firmly believing in interlinkage between rights and development. With less rights and deepening inequalities and income gaps, it's so much more difficult to achieve positive results in development and sustainability. One of the best ways we can follow in order to promote the whole process on social protection is to work through civil society. For us also to help build up and interact with strong civil society organizations in the countries which can put pressure on the political leadership in Africa and elsewhere. We would like to have more support from our own government and more interaction with our government in this and be a good partner in the whole debate about the post-2015 agenda. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sten. Both Gunilla and Claire earlier spoke about affordability, and you are quoting Thandika Mkandawire, who yesterday said that actually investing in social security systems can be done also when you're a very poor country, and that will lead to affordability. Would you like to comment upon the fact that we have so different approaches to this? Why is that, do you think?
It depends on size, I think. If you're a small country, you can afford to cover programs like this in your own budget, like they do in Rwanda, for instance, where they have a very good social security system in place. Also maybe in Uganda, they can cover quite a lot of the needs for that. But in Namibia, also a small country, they can afford to roll out the big scheme, as they call it, basic income grant scheme. It would take maybe 3-4% of their annual budget as it is now. But much more difficult in countries with large populations like Tanzania, for instance. And I think the rolling out of this TASAF scheme to 7 million people would cost several $100 million. Isn't it, Torsten? You've just been there. 300, yes. So it's much more difficult to do it there. But they can maybe target some poor provinces or so. Or there are different ways and means to do that. And they must need, I think, external funding also during the first 5-10 years or so.
Thank you very much, Sten. And now the floor is open for questions to the panelists, so just wave your hand. We have somebody waving up there, and it would be great if you could also state your name and who you represent.
Thank you. I'm Louise Steinwachs, working for Bread for the World in Germany. I have two small questions. One goes to the lady from the International Trade Union. I'm not sure whether I have understood you correctly acoustically, so to say. You talked about the social protection floor, ILO concept, and then I think you said something like the UN General Assembly has adopted. What exactly has it adopted? So I didn't get this point. And the other question goes to the former ambassador. Since you have just mentioned the basic income grant in Namibia and how much it would cost, what do you think is the reason that it's not going to be, as it looks at the moment, to be rolled out in the whole country?
Thank you very much. Anyone else? We have a question here at the second row, and then one over there. Okay. You go ahead, Karin. It's fine. It's complicated.
Okay, I start. My name is Gunilla Carlsson, Church of Sweden. During these 2 days, we have heard a lot of arguments and a lot about the experiences from Sweden about if you really want to target the poor, it's actually more effective to have a universal vision, or then in details is different. But this sort of universal broad coverage is really the most best in many ways. However, now when we see globally how the expansion of social protection is going on and very much supported by World Bank, DFID and others, which means it's mostly then the Anglo-Saxon model, which is not has this universal aspiration. Then my question to Gunilla and Anna Brandt is, to what extent is now the experiences of Sweden with this universal coverage kind of approach guiding the input that Sweden has in various international forums? And I think the question to Gunilla Carlsson, that it was really targeting the poor rather than universal coverage, which was the focus of the high-level panel, is quite important issue.
Thank you very much. And we have another question before giving the floor to the panel.
Okay, my name is Karin Norberg, and I would like to make one comment and one question. My comment is to what Sten Rylander told about Tandika and Kandavira, that we are catching up. It's true, we are catching up with Tandika and Kandavira, but the fact is that while he was director of UN UNRIS, the UN Research Institute for Social Development, it was through a large contribution, financial contribution from SIDA, that he could initiate the program, which has resulted in this library of social policy documentation, which we have heard about yesterday, and also from Jimmy Adesina, who was part of that particular group who worked on covering and mapping social policy issues in Africa. And this brings me to a question about the UN and the role of UN and research. UNRIS has been for many, many years mainly funded by the Nordic countries, but this is no longer the case. And we have presently a campaign going on in Swedish newspapers against UN, against particularly development cooperation being channeled through the UN, Sweden among the Nordic countries being a main funder of programs within UN. And this relates, of course, also to the work which is now presently being done on the post-2015 agenda. So I would like not just those who are more or less responsible for these issues in the panel, but I would like the whole panel to comment what is going on and how comes that Swedish newspapers drive this campaign against UN at this critical moment when we are preparing for setting important targets for the future development agenda. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Karin, and I encourage all the panelists to try to comment upon Karin's question related to, as far as I can see, one Swedish news paper. First, we had a question about the social protection floor to Claire Courteille, and then a question about the social protection system in Namibia to Sten Rylander, and then for Gunilla Carlsson and Anna Brandt about the Anglo-Saxon model that Gunilla Carlsson asked about, universal versus targeting, and then the question from Karin Norberg on the role of Sweden in the UN and how the UN is working on development. So I suggest Claire starts with the question on the UN General Assembly and the social protection floor.
Yeah, sorry, I was probably rushing and wasn't clear. So what happened is that in 2009, you had what we call the Bachelet report, that Mrs. Bachelet helped to write, and that was, I think, back in 2009. And then it went to it was presented officially and officially endorsed by the General Assembly in the UN. I think it was in 2011. And then after that, in 2012, you had a resolution of the ECOSOC, the Economic and Social Committee of the UN, who was calling upon member states to put social protection floor really at the heart of development policy. And then there was the G20, who made a call upon the member states and the international organization to work together for the implementation of social protection floor at the national level. So I was trying to condense everything in one sentence, and it didn't work, apparently.
It could also be mentioned that early on, when the MDGs were rather new, ILO, I guess with the backing of the Confederation, actually managed to get employment and decent work into the target and indicator system of the MDGs after it had been decided upon. So you have been pushing for a long time. Sten, on Namibia.
On Namibia, it's easy to answer. It was divided views within the government. The big scheme was supported by Hage Geingob, then Minister of Trade and Industry. And the interesting situation is now, he has become Prime Minister, and he's also President in waiting, you can see. 2015, he will be probably the President of Namibia. Whereas the President today, Hifikepunye Pohamba, he was against it, and the then Prime Minister Nelson Angola also against it. They are old leaders, and they couldn't see the situation of giving out cash to poor people, who they are lousy and not working and so on. There was a generation gap, and I think there are good chances for the scheme in a year or so's time when Hage Geingob has taken over.
Thank you, Sten. And who would want to start on universal versus targeting?
A little bit, if I just refer to how this is discussed in the panel, I think the more general or universal systems has served Sweden very well. And it's also that it's not marginalizing people. But I think it's also about the costs and the constraints on the macroeconomy that makes stakeholders, that is mainly actually the partner country, reluctant to do the broad general systems. And that's why we need, linked to the question of Karin Norberg, we need more knowledge. We need to have the good research and to show where you can bring the best results. But why we have this also as donors, because it has been an Anglo-Saxon model, you could say, but it's also that we have, when doing development assistance, look a little bit to the results and trying to figure out what will work and not, and then we try to see where can we target more vulnerable groups, because we talk now a lot, and I concentrated on what drives development, employability, the young people, but we also have vulnerability within countries, like, for example, aging population that never ever had the chance, and that they could be to enter labor market, and that they could be very riskful for them because they are in the informal sector and they might be used very much. So there we have worked a lot to try to target different groups in development assistance, whether it's an Anglo-Saxon way or not, but I think that's the explanation why that has been more interesting to do, but also that some of the research, having looked into this, have seen that that could be justified. But I think it's two different questions. One part of the question could be said to World Bank and to donors, what do you want to finance? But you also have to put the question, and as I said in my introduction, we have to talk to finance ministers in partner countries to see how can you mobilize your own resources to introduce your own general systems that will help your economy to function better. So I think that's also one way of trying to explain why it has been more tasty, if I may use that word, to target specific groups when we do development assistance. And that is also my final point on Karin's question, if I should. I'll try.
Absolutely, go ahead.
I'm not responsible any longer, but my general reflection as a newspaper reader in Sweden, aid is about money. The core of aid is actually money. And I think we have a misperception in Sweden about what aid is about. There is, I think, for the general public, not enough knowledge about that we actually do a lot more than just trying to deliver handouts, whether it's contraceptives or it's fresh water or well, whatever. There is not enough knowledge about what is modern aid. And that's why I think we have this kind of debate. And the problem is that we've never been able to tell about the good results because we didn't have that management. That's at least my explanation why you could have so high attraction on these kind of questions. And I must say also that we have to come back to that this is actually about the poor people's perspective that should receive qualified and good qualitative aid. But it's also about the taxpayers in Sweden that would like to see what works and what doesn't work. And there also, I think, that also UN should be part of that, and we still have some homework to do.
Anyone else who wants to comment on Karin's question on the UN and Sweden? Erik?
Well, I see perhaps that as sort of the latest attack, this time from this particular newspaper. But this is a trend that we've seen over the past 5 to 10 years, that somehow everything is being questioned, also the work of civil society organizations, the various state-to-state support that we have also through SIDA and others. So it's quite interesting. And then for me it's a question of course also which I want to direct to you, Gunilla, our sort of common responsibility for sort of reporting on the good results as you are indicating, and to make sure that, for instance, editors of the biggest morning dailies are updated about the situation, because we have seen this when we have had debates, for instance, in this political week, Almedal and Gotland, that it's an incredibly negative attitude towards development aid in general and what we actually are achieving through development cooperation. So I think we have a common challenge there.
Thank you. Anyone
and
else?
we try to do our bit, but it's not easy to come across in media from a civil society organization.
I think what I try to do over I mean, this is one of the most hard, but also the most daunting task you can have. It's actually to protect the integrity of aid, but also to make it legitimate and be able to tell about what it is. And I think it takes two to tango here. We are not living in an isolated bubble. And actually, I've been to many African states, and I visited newly the World Economic Forum, and where also our partners are questioning our way of doing aid and say that we moved out of, we gained independence, but now we have to move out of aid dependency. So I think we also have to realize that we need to constantly be able to transform and to understand why people are questioning, and we should give them the good answers. And I think, again, that's why I've been burning for trying to show facts and figures. We talked about knowledge, research. I think facts helps in political discussions, and specifically when you're measuring on results, and also realizing that the core of aid is actually about money, and that's why you have to know how you're dealing with money.
Anna, you waved.
Yes, just very quickly, on this issue about targeting versus universality, because I think it's a very difficult question, and you can argue for both systems, and I think they might be applicable in different circumstances. And so I'm at a disadvantage because I haven't been here all day and heard the debates earlier, but I think we need to have more issues on the table and more knowledge about the advantages and disadvantages of various systems. And I would very much welcome a very strong and lively voice from the Church of Sweden and from other NGOs on this this matter as we move forward into the discussions around a post-2015 agenda, because social protection is featuring there in many of the policy documents that are underpinning what we will be doing for the next few years. A Swedish position that's there, a position of the European Union, but it's in very general terms. So it's up to us to really define exactly what we would like to put into this on our way forward. So we would very much welcome a continued discussion with you on that.
Thank you, Anna. And Sten, you wanted to
Very
in as well?
briefly, I think when it comes to multilateral aid through UN channels and so on, we should be tough, demanding, and we should, there should be links between money given and results achieved, and one should have transparent reviews about that. But I was a bit sad when I saw these articles in the Svenska Dagbladet. I felt they were very sweeping, very general, and not enough knowledge about how these UN agencies operate. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Can I say, since I've worked in the UN and step out of my shoes as a moderator, and say that the UN certainly needs renewal. It needs better management, I would say generally, and I've seen it myself. But we need to work with that, not only to do UN bashing, because we need this gel that the multilateral cooperation is about, the credibility that a joined-up effort means in the field, if I use that term. And not least do we need the norms and standard setting and the policy discussions that happen in boards of different specialized agencies, funds, and programs, because aid is in this respect not only about handouts, as Gunilla also said, but it's actually about moving forward together in this very, very complex world.
And here I think also talking about the 2015 agenda, what we discussed a lot, because you wanted to have insights from the panel, it is actually
Finally.
the risk of multilateralism dying.
Yeah.
I mean, the need in a globalized world that we could have more multilateral cooperation and understanding, but also using the platforms that are provided and that they're already there. So we have to restore it, whether it's WTO or it's
FAO.
UNDP or FAO or ILO. So I think this is very important for us, not only when it comes to the UN, but also other multilateral platforms should be used, and that is something we talked at length about, where many people were rather negative, seeing to the reality of today. And may I also, when we talk about general or the Anglo-Saxon way of funding social protection flows and developing transformative economies, the UN high-level panel worked on a universal basis. It's not about the so-called poor with the so-called rich. It is a universal agenda where we should share our expertise and knowledge. So again, I have to remind that it is not about aid, and it's not only about MDG+. It's a transformative agenda that should be universal and binding for all, and where everyone has to contribute, and where the new set of goals, if I would see them come true, would be much more challenging and important for Sweden as well. That's what I hope. And then we could also have perhaps this global debate and exchange and sharing understanding about what works and what doesn't.
I'm sorry to have been abusing the time. I see Ulrika stepping up on the stage, so maybe we have to round up now, or is there room for more questions?
Two more.
Three.
We have left. One more, perhaps.
Presskonferens också.
We have 5 minutes to go. Okay. Okay, so let's actually round up immediately. I'm really sorry, and I'm also sorry that we have not talked specifically about pensions or had the opportunity to listen to Help Age or PRO Global. And I'll give 30 seconds to each and every one of the panelists to so that you will bring something important back with you when we finalize this conference. Claire?
Okay. Yeah, I think I agree with many things that have been said, and I think the key challenge is that there is one, facing the world, and the task of the panel, etc., is the issue of inequality, because we've been discussing poverty and inequality are linked, and really from our perspective at least, addressing inequality requires redistribution of wealth within country, between countries, but it also requires redistribution of power. And this is where I was insisting so much on the democratic dimension, giving the power to the people, giving people a voice. I think it's crucial to address this agenda.
Thank you. Erik?
Well, I think I can only agree with the last speaker, but also sort of taking up this challenge from Anna about when we sort of discuss this at length, the need for social protection systems, we have to analyze the pros and cons of sort of universal and targeted social protection schemes, and this is a challenge we can take upon ourselves as churches we know as well, to take part in that debate, even though we have sort of a point of departure in that debate.
Sten?
I use my 30 seconds mentioning another issue, international tax on financial transfers. It was mentioned yesterday. I think there is a majority among the OECD member states that one should investigate and introduce such a tax. But in our country, they are dead against it. There is an entrenched, fundamentalistic resistance to international taxation in our Ministry of Finance. And I hope we can overcome that, because we need that to finance social protection, but also climate change. Thank you.
Gunilla?
Well, don't miss the opportunity to end poverty in our times, and really targeted and learning more about the poorest of the poor so that they have a voice and can participate.
Thank you. And Anna?
Social protection is clearly linked to entry into the labor market and a vital instrument to end poverty, reduce risk and vulnerability, reduce inequalities, and enhance opportunities.
Thank you. And now we've heard about some dilemmas that we need to work with, all of us, I guess, and that's how the informal economy comes into that, and the fact that people don't have legal identity, general versus targeting, labor versus rights, or maybe in combination. I think this has been a very, very fruitful debate, and I thank all the panelists for their contributions.
Fruitful debate, that is really the word. I feel I'm like a terrorist to have to cut this off, because it has been extremely interesting days. And just to spare a couple of seconds, please help yourselves from Pippi Longstocking's bag, because I would like to, maybe some of you guests think this, all this talk about Pippi Longstocking's golden coins is just something silly. But if you, maybe you remember from the trip with the fairy tale train yesterday night at Junibacken, built to celebrate the writer Astrid Lindgren, who wrote the story of Pippi. This has its interest in the light of this conference, actually. Pippi Longstocking, world famous for being very strong with red plates. She could lift her horse on one arm, and she had all this money. She was self-sustained, she was courageous, and she was strong. She was born in 1945, and as a daughter of peace and progress, she had really chosen the right country. Not because of Swedes being so peaceful, but we were so extremely lucky at the time. The country and its industry not severely damaged from war. Export industry went like a rocket. Wealth and growth spread. Suddenly, this little country was extremely rich and had enormous opportunities. And there you have the embryo of the welfare state of modern days. But the welfare state was not a gift given from the government to the people. It was not something handed out. The welfare state had its origins in 100 years of conflict and struggle and battle and class conflicts and compromises. And that is very, very important to remember. And you could see from the train where we traveled through Astrid Lindgren's literary landscapes. There were a lot of scenery from an old world, an old countryside world with small red cottages, with poor people, disadvantaged kids, beggars, poor people's home, old people's poorhouse, where miserable people were living under terrible conditions. And all these things Astrid Lindgren remembered from her childhood. So the old country is always shadowing the new country in her stories. And I think that is why she also is a beloved author. The life of the poor Swedes who had absolutely no social protection in the modern sense of the word, Pippi Longstocking represents the total opposite. She takes command of her own life, but she's not a selfish girl. She knows that people around her need social protection and democratic equal interaction. And the one who is very strong must also be very kind. That is her motto when she empowers other children with courage and her gold coins. We've just heard that the core of aid is money. That's true. But aid without a heart, it's not much to count on either. At least I think Pippi would agree on that. And personally, I think she will not oppose of Jimmy Adesina's expression, Ubuntu, I see myself in you. That is quite Pippi Longstockish too. So thank you, all of you, partakers, speakers, debaters, audiences, organizers. Thank you very much for 2 very interesting days.